You talked about different types of linguistic discrimination, and you talked about cultural discrimination. What's the difference between the two? Could you elaborate just so we have a working definition? And Angelica, you also talked about covert and overt discrimination. I'm curious. I actually want to learn more about that. And I'm sure people who are listening also want to know more about that.
Yeah, so let me give you, I like to provide examples because it's more telling.
Yes.
So let me put it this way. I remember once I went to a new dentist. I was living in Toronto. That was some years ago. And my partner recommended her to me. He was saying, "Oh, you're here in Toronto now, so you might as well go to the same dentist as me." And he loves to tell people that I'm from Brazil, probably because he finds being from Canada boring. So he says, "Oh, yeah,
Oh,
my partner's from Brazil." And it's like an easy way to start a conversation. So people are always interested. So he had told her that I was from Brazil and that I was going to come and blah, blah, blah. And when I arrived there, I was in the waiting room. And when she called my name, she was like, "Angelica?" And I was the only one in the room, right? And I was like, "Oh, yeah, that's me." And she was like, she looked at me like, "Oh, aren't you Brazilian?" And I said, "Yeah." And she was like, "Oh, but you don't look Brazilian." And I was like, "Oh, I'm sorry." I'm sorry that I don't look Brazilian. I don't know what
right.
expectations you had. Oh, and you don't speak Brazilian either. And I was like, oh, again, I'm sorry that that does sound Brazilian. So in this case, it's not a very explicit
Right.
discrimination. She was not telling me, oh, I hate Brazilians. I hate the way you speak. I hate the way you look. But of course, she had a right. She had an idea of what a Brazilian looks like, what a Brazilian sounds like, and it was very clear that she communicated that with me. I usually don't mind much because I do studies in this
Right.
area, right? So I know that these people need help to get educated and get used to having different looking people speaking different languages, right? The same thing as if a white guy starts speaking Chinese and people go, "Oh, you speak Chinese, but you're white," right? Same idea.
Got
Or I remember I was working in a college once and somebody came to me, a teacher came to me and he said, "Oh, Angelica, you need to help me here understand something. There is a Japanese guy in my class and he says he's Brazilian." And I said, "Yeah." And it was like, "How can this be?" I was like, "What do you mean?" I did not understand what he meant by that comment, right? So he was a Japanese ethnicity, Japanese, grew up in Brazil, speaks Portuguese as a first language, came to Canada to learn English, and he defines himself as Brazilian, which is totally normal for us. So this is an example of discrimination, but it's a discriminatory
Mhm.
bias, not necessarily. And we have other explicit, which is not very likely to happen as much in Canada.
Why is that?
Um, because it's discrimination. You could even be taken to jail against people. So saying things like, "Oh, your accent is horrible," or you shouldn't be here if you don't speak the language, or "You have to speak the language if you're here. And if you don't, you should go back to your country."
Interesting.
Things
I've
like,
heard that on the streets of Toronto a few times.
yeah, you hear that on the
Yeah.
streets sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Or, yeah, like in Quebec, sometimes I try to speak French and people look at me and they go, "Oh, you can use English since you are an immigrant." So they already
Mhm.
assume that I am an immigrant because I speak English, but it's not necessarily English. It's the fact that I am an
Right.
immigrant here, right? So linguistic discrimination and cultural discrimination never come alone. It's not based on the language only. Usually it intersects with other things, right? With identity, for example, I don't like immigrants, therefore I don't like the way you speak.
Right.
Like all international students come to Canada and there is a housing crisis now because of international students. Because of you, I cannot buy. So there are a lot of ideas behind through the
Right.
language. But it's all your thinking, right? If you change your mindset, that's why the work that I do is on multilingualism, on prelingualism, because if you're able to switch that key in your mind, it's just like going to therapy. You go to therapy for years, for 10 years, and then one day there is that, wow, that's what I do. Oh, that's what I should do for my life. Yes, awesome. And then you become it's almost like that switch that I am very interested in doing
Uh,
with people.
let me ask you about that.
Wish me luck.
Good luck with that. Let me ask more about that switch that we need to. I was thinking because you talked. I really thanks for talking about this whole linguistic discrimination. I've witnessed quite a lot of that in Toronto, to be honest. I think my question then, since you are working on a project on this and you speak so passionately about this, Angelica, how can educators, language educators, teachers, people in the trenches, and even institutions, colleges, universities, what do you how can they actively combat this form of prejudice, both within and outside, if you have any thoughts on that?
Hmm. Now that's a very big question, and there are different ways to do that. And I think it's a collective effort. We are not going to do this over time. Sorry,
Mhm.
overnight. Just tomorrow, everybody,
Oh, yeah, it's done.
you know. But there are different ways to do that. For educators, of course, engaging in teacher education. If you are inside the university, and if your university already has a program on plurilingual approaches, multilingual approaches to language education, that's great. Look for those
Mhm.
programs. Go after those programs. Take a look at the courses you're going to take. Have policies, of course. When we think about EDI policies,
Mm.
for example, equity, diversity,
Yes.
inclusion, decolonization, right? None of these policies, as I am aware of in colleges or universities, have language as an issue of except for English and French. So, for example, if you are in an English speaking university and you want to submit assignments in French, you are allowed to do that. But we don't see that happening with other languages. And I understand why, because professors are not going to speak all of the languages, et cetera, et cetera. But that doesn't mean that students themselves cannot engage in academic content in different language, right? So if I am a speaker, oh, here's my cat. He wants to be part of the
Yes.
podcast. If you are a person who speaks two languages, three, four, doesn't matter. Why should you stick to the language of instruction of that particular university? So if you are in an English speaking university, or if you are in a school, why do you think you have to stick to English only content, right? For example, podcasts in different languages, articles published in different languages, watching news in different languages, accessing content on social media in different languages. If we don't do this, we run the risk of linguistic genocide, not only here, but across the globe, right? How many people do we know in countries that have received a lot of immigrants that after generation two, the second or third generation, the language of the family is lost? It's not a coincidence. I speak for myself too, because my family, I have Spanish and Italian immigrants. These languages were barely, so I was the third generation. It just wasn't lost because I went to school again and studied, but my sisters don't speak those
So
languages,
you're the
right?
last one. So
I
it ends with
am.
you.
Maybe I'll have more
Hopefully,
generations to
hopefully,
come.
yes. So it doesn't end with you because, as you said, okay,
Yeah.
interesting.
So
Okay.
yeah, so we think about immigrants here in Canada. How many of these immigrants, for example, if they come with a family and the kids grow up here at home, they may use the language of the family, but then at school they use, let's say, English. Some of them are even embarrassed to, tell other people that they speak other languages at home or that they come from other places because a fear of discrimination, et cetera, and our sense of belonging,
Mm.
right? That's a huge mistake. So if I'm going in circles here, I forgot the first question, but you were asking about the different measures that we
Yeah.
can. So we can do policies, we can do teacher education in society. So that's what I'm very interested in. So many people, not only language teachers and students, but also the public in general who speak different languages and those who don't speak different languages to learn how to accept
For me,
diversity.
that's the big question. You said at the beginning, demystifying plurilingualism, and I don't know, maybe this is just my bias. We all have biases, right? Working with
Yeah.
international students, working with teachers who work with international students. That seems like the people who are probably more likely to already be empathetic to those situations. But demystifying for the general public, demystifying for, in this case, Canadians who only speak English or only speak French, that's the big challenge. How do we, there's no answer to this, so I'm going to put you on the spot, but what's one piece of research you've come across or that you've conducted, one strategy that has worked in that kind of avenue?
Yeah. It's always easier to convince the ones who already speak multiple
Right.
languages, right? I would think that though, but a lot of language teachers have a huge bias
Okay.
Really?
because language education was pretty much founded on native speakerism,
Yes.
right? So if you were educated,
The
you
transfer of
know,
one to the other,
20 years
right? Yeah.
ago, 15 years ago,
That's
yeah,
true.
so
That's true.
you're a
The CELTA course was
Okay.
created for native speakers of English.
there you
Yes.
go. Exactly. Yeah, I did my CELTA too way back when. Oh my goodness, very native speaker, like almost didn't pass it. I'm kidding. I did. But one of the things that I'm very interested in is not necessarily convincing the ones who need to be convinced, but empowering those who speak multiple languages to not take crap
Mm,
from, the people who discriminate against them. If you feel that someone is giving you a hard time because of who you are, because of the way you speak, because of the languages you speak, do not say, I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, no, don't say, I'm sorry. Why are you saying I'm sorry? Sorry for what? For being who you are. You don't have to fight back, but you can just try and say, yeah, these are the languages that I speak. And would you like to learn? Or this is how I speak. Did you understand? Yes, I did, but there is no, if you understood, I able to, was my speech comprehensible to you? Yeah, but then should be okay. And hopefully they're going to have this little something in their head. Wow, there was this very empowered person who maybe taught me something here. Because if we continue to apologize for the way we speak, the way we act, we are contributing to a society that is not diverse. And that's a detriment not only to Canada. When I say society, I don't mean Canada, it's any society
Mm.
really. So yeah. And of course representation, right? So when you are I have noticed a firm believer that things are changing. And I think the experiences that I had 10 years ago in Canada don't happen as much as they used to, the negative experiences, right? I don't hear um, people who speak different languages reporting these negative experiences as much. I think things are changing. We see the body of faculty across universities or language schools having more diverse faculty members and teachers, right? The students are always diverse, more and more, right? But if you do not have the representation of diversity, in teaching, um, in other more senior positions, then it's very unlikely that this is going to change. Yeah, but things are changing. I have seen several positive uh, things happening, and
That's
yeah,
good.